I'm Ari Gottesman. I'm currently a senior at Ladue Horton Watkins High School, and this will be a lecture about how to run and how to give a big stick affirmative. So, what big stick means, first of all, is generally just the biggest impacts. You're going to focus on big things like climate change, war, um, biodiversity, whatever it may be. It's something that's going to affect a large population of people. And because of this, it means that there's a lot of weight put on impacts. Um, Generally, what it means is that at least half of the debate, if not more, is focused on whether the affirmative plan has big impacts, whether you can solve those impacts, and whether or not they're more important than those of the negative team. So, to start off, this is the affirmative that I ran with my partner this year. Um, and so this topic was not really that friendly to big stick AFs because it was about criminal justice, which is mostly an issue that affects fewer people. It's going to focus more on marginalized groups than it is on like big extinction things. So in in other years, there are going to generally be better, more concrete things. Um, but we still have this example, and it's still pretty good. Um, so to start, we have a regular plan. Um, these will always be written in the same way. And now to get into our advantages, most apps will have two, sometimes three, as you can see here. Um, there are four main parts of an advantage. Um, there's the uniqueness, the link, the internal link, and the impact. Um, and also link is used interchangeably with solvency. So first of all, for uniqueness, this is basically just the problem that exists currently. And there's also another thing that's called impact uniqueness that goes along with that. But I'll get to there in a sec. So first of all, the uniqueness of the advantage. Basically, for this one, we're saying that currently there is a problem where taxes are not being collected correctly. Um, and the problem is that high income earners are getting out of paying their taxes. So that's our uniqueness. This is the problem. Our plan solves that problem. So that's the link, right? Our plan solves this, and it is going to then spill out to have some impact. So then the internal link is kind of what connects that link that our plan is solving this problem to the impact. So in this case, our internal links are basically saying that fixing the audit rates of these high income earners is key to economic growth. Economic growth um, is going to reduce poverty, and economic growth is also going to decrease the chance of conflict spilling out. And the U.S. gaining this revenue is also important um, to dealing with our positions across the world, which decrease conflict. So, in essence, what we're saying is that our plan generates money, and the money is going to stop conflict. And then the impact is basically just there will be a conflict if we don't do this. Um, and the impact uniqueness, as I mentioned earlier, is basically just saying there's not a war right now and it's not going to start. Or there's not a war right now, but it is going to start unless we do this. Um, and so what we're saying throughout the entire advantage is basically just that we can stop this conflict by passing the AF. And now, the big thing that a lot of people with um, miss with big stick affirmatives is they say this is crazy and this is ridiculous. No there's no reason to believe that there's an 100% chance that the world is going to go into war because we don't pass this one tax plan, um, and there's no reason we should believe this. Um, but the thing is, that's not really the argument you're trying to make whenever you run one of these AFs. You're never saying there's an 100% chance everyone dies. And this is going to tie into the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is impact calculus. So, whenever you run a big stick AF, what you're trying to say is that this issue might only happen in 1% or 5% or 0.1% of possible futures. But extinction is really bad that we should decrease the chance of it in every case possible. Right? Because if everybody goes extinct, if all humans go extinct, then it doesn't matter what else happens. We're all gone and there's no way to come back from it. So in that sense, extinction is an infinite impact. There is no way to come back from it. There is no solution to it after it happens, which means that you should avoid it in every single situation possible. So, even if there's only a 1% chance that this conflict happens and that it could cause extinction, it's worth discussing because of how bad it could possibly be if it actually does. So that's where big stick apps fit in. You're not trying to say that this is a regular problem that is going to affect everybody on a day-to-day basis. What you're trying to say is there is a chance, and probably a pretty big one, that this impact could happen. And the only way to stop that, or at least the best way, is through the affirmative plan. And in the case of this one, President Biden has actually been pushing to do a very similar thing. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out after. But for big stick AFs, the thing that the debate should really center on once you get to the 1AR, the 2NR, and the 2AR is impact calc. And debating impacts is really important. It gets separated generally into three ideas: probability, magnitude, and time frame. And there's a good chance that you've heard some of these mentioned before. So the idea is probability would be the chance that the impact actually happens times the chance that you can solve it. So there's always some mistake made where people will say climate change has an 100% probability, which means that it's the most important thing in this round. And yes, climate change is happening. It has an 100% probability. But you also have to think about what the chances are that this AF specifically could actually solve it. So if it's an affirmative plan that will create one nuclear plant, that's not going to stop climate change. But if it's one that would drastically change world health measures and decrease pollution globally, then that is a better chance of solving it. So that would be a higher probability than the one nuclear plant. The second is magnitude. Generally, this is thought of as just how many people will die. And there are other ways to think about it, but this is the simplest way to think about it, and in most scenarios is just the best. Or it doesn't have to be just die, but die, suffer, are affected by it. Climate change, billions of people will be affected by it. Nuclear war, billions of people will be affected by it. One small-scale conflict in the Mediterranean Sea, not many people will be affected by it. And even if it's like a few million, it doesn't compare to the other examples I brought up. So in this case, it's how important is it to deal with this topic? Should we care more about 5 million people or 5 billion people? That's where the argument comes in for magnitude. And then you can combine that with probability and say, is it more important to have a 75% chance of saving 5 million lives or a 1% chance of saving 5 billion? And that's a good argument to have. And that's what a lot of arguments might boil down to within a big stick debate round, is what are the trade-offs we're willing to make and what are the most important things to solve first. Now the last thing is time frame. Time frame is just how quickly the problem will actually arise and how quickly can we solve it. So climate change has a really long time frame. It's been going on for a while, and it's going to go on for a while longer before everybody dies from it. Right? So the time that climate change might cause extinction could be past the year 2100. Right? And there are these markers that we have to stop it before 2050 or 2030. But in the end of the day, there will be some solution that we could come to before everybody dies in the year 2100 or later, or even 2050. Versus nuclear war, which if we say Pakistan and India are going to start a global nuclear war, that could kill everybody in the next year. So, do we want to deal with climate change, which is a problem we know will always be there, and a problem that will affect just as many people, but we might have an extra 100 years to solve it, or nuclear war, which has a lower probability of happening, but it can happen a lot sooner, which means that the window to deal with the problem is going to be um, the window to deal with the problem is much smaller. So an argument on time frame will often be it's more important to solve the issues that are going to come up sooner first, and then deal with the other stuff after. So deal with deal with nuclear war right now, and then after we're done with that, then we can deal with climate change. And so the ends of debate rounds will often come down to these three ideas and which ones you find the most important. So is it who wins the arguments of whether we should value probability or value magnitude or value time frame? And then what an important thing to do is when covering these is to actually talk about that. If you are running the climate change um, impact against somebody who's running a nuclear war impact, what you can do is say climate change is more important based on probability. And probability is more important because the 0.1% chance of nuclear war does not outweigh the 75% chance that everybody dies from climate change and that we can solve it. So we should value the climate change more simply because it's more sure that it'll affect everybody on Earth than nuclear war is. And then on the flip side, the person with nuclear war can say, well, there's no coming back from nuclear war, and it might be coming soon. So we should deal with this and then get to climate change after. And that's an argument that needs to be had. Which of these is more important to discuss? If it's probability, then the climate change team will win. If it's time frame, then the nuclear war team might win. And this is just something that will happen in most debate rounds. When you're discussing impacts, you have to be talking about why your impact is what you should be valuing in that round. And so this is the main difference that big stick AFs will have from like the soft left AFs that discuss like social justice issues or smaller scale issues, is you'll be spending much more time debating these impacts. And another important connection to make is that the links are basically probability. So if you say that our AF has an 100% chance of solving it, then you're saying we have an 100% probability to solve it if it's a problem, right? So if your link is bad, just think of it as if you say that this AF that increases economic growth through taxes, right? If there's no actual link between economic growth and conflict, then there's just a 0% probability that our AF can actually solve it. So then you can just think about the rest of an advantage as a part of the impact, right? How likely are we to actually solve this problem? And that's how you can realize that the debate for these specifically come down to what impacts are the most important and discussing why they're the most important. And that's the biggest thing about big stick AFs. Other than that, most of the debate will come in the same way. You'll still have the plan, inherency, solvency, and you'll have your advantage. It's just that instead of focusing more on the small scale suffering, that sounds wrong because it's not always small scale. Instead of focusing on suffering and human rights and social justice issues, it focuses on these big, huge, probably lower probability things of happening, and because of that, puts more emphasis on impact calc, on discussing why it doesn't matter that it's a 0.1% probability, or why it doesn't matter that it's 100 years in the future, because it affects so many people. And so that's why big stick AFs are not just thrown out the window for being crazy talk, right? It's not just that these have such a low probability, so we shouldn't discuss them. What you're trying to argue through these AFs is that even though they have a low probability, we still need to discuss them. And if you looked back 30 years, it would be a lot more reasonable for people to be discussing nuclear war, right? In the middle of the Cold War, there were really high tensions. So even when there are slightly lower tensions right now, maybe it's still worth discussing so that if we ever are in that situation again, we've already had this discussion and we're already ready for what's to come. These are the thoughts that you have to be thinking about with these big stick apps. Why do you want to run it? And why is it important to talk about? And if you can come to these answers, that it is important to talk about these things, it is important to talk about these big issues like climate change and nuclear war, and you have a way of solving those through the topic, then big stick apps are great. And they provide a way to talk about these topics that a lot of other situations wouldn't allow you to talk about. They can be good for the debate space. They can allow us to talk about these things and also have fun talking about some things that don't normally scrape the media attention, right? Most media outlets aren't focusing on the chance that India and Pakistan have a big nuclear conflict with each other because they're low probability. But maybe it's something that we should be talking about anyway. So that's what big stick apps are about. They're about these conflicts that might be lower probability, or they might not always come into media attention, or they might not always be solvable by one thing. But the thing is, they're always big. That's what the big stick is for, right? You have to have these big impacts that have a large magnitude. And from there, discuss why it's important to value it, even if it might have a low probability. And along with that, if there's ever a situation where you're running a big stick app and somebody runs a more soft left disadvantage or counter plan, or something along those lines, you have this clash of our big impacts versus their smaller ones. This is where this knowledge of why you're discussing it is important, right? So they're discussing how these millions of people that are being affected by these social justice issues are important, and that's when you have to say, yes, they are, but extinction, even if less probable, is more important. And in that same way, you still have to bring in impact calc. You still have to talk about why you should value your impact, even if it's so rare. And this is the main key to a big stick app that differentiates it from other apps on topics, is that you just have to focus on impacts. Impacts in a big stick app are by far the most important part of the debate. You have to discuss it, and in doing so, you'll become much better at debate as a whole. You'll get a better idea of why we're having debate, and you'll also do a better job of executing these big stick apps well and winning rounds on why it's important to value these big impacts like nuclear war, like climate change, like disease. And disease is actually seemingly more common because of COVID. So like disease, like biodiversity, all of these things. You're discussing why are they more important, and it's up to you to come up with your reasons in the round why you should value them. I hope that you learned something from watching this about big stick apps and how to run them, and hopefully you can use this knowledge to go on future topics and really execute them well and win rounds because you talked about these big impacts that just might happen. Thank you. And thank you for watching.